It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Unterhitzenberger. I am an associate professor in project management at the University of Leeds. I'm also the director of the Leeds Centre for Projects. And one of my areas of research which has accompanied me since I've done my PhD is fairness and unfairness in projects. And this is going to be the topic of today's discussion. And we did a study last year, 2 years ago, which was kindly funded by the Association for Project Management, together with Kate Lawrence. Kate, do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Yes, thank you, Christine. Yes, I'm Kate. I have been working with Christine. I joined the University of Leeds in 2019 after finishing my PhD in Manchester. I spent 20-ish years in industry and construction and estates management, and then decided to go back and do my PhD. And so what was really interesting about this project, which was looking at fairness and unfairness in projects, was that I recognised quite a lot of what people were saying to us. And so at least it wasn't just me then. And I think that people will read the report and also had those feelings as well. Actually, feelings, something shared is people talking about these things. You think, oh, actually, that was me as well. So I'll stop rambling and I'll hand you back to Christine. Sorry.
Thanks, Kate. And this was very much, as Kate just said, the ones who work in industry. I've worked in industry as well before I started out in academia. I so often recognized these situations, but it is not really something you talk about or you read about in the context of projects, because it's very much accepted that life is not fair and get used to it. I think especially in the project context, initially when I had discussions with people about fairness in projects, I also heard comments such as, oh, we can't really afford that because it means kind of we need to hand out things and it's just not something that we do. We need to be tough and we need to kind of pursue our claims, etc. And I hope that this brief presentation today gives you a bit of an insight that that's not actually what fairness is about, and that it maybe raises a little bit awareness amongst all of us what it means, how people perceive it, what an impact it can have on your team members or also on yourself when you are treated fairly or unfairly, and that we collectively raise awareness of the importance of fairness in projects. Because sometimes when we make attempts maybe to be fair and say we put one process in place and that applies to everyone, that might not necessarily be the actually fair solution to the problem. I mean, making the fish climb the tree will probably not work. But we could say, well, we had a clear selection process in place. So not treating everyone equal is not necessarily always fair. So what is fairness about? Fairness is under the concept of organizational justice. And that is how individuals perceive fair or unfair treatment in the working environment. And one of the important things about fairness is that fairness in the working environment and in projects is subjective. So it is about how an individual perceives to be treated. And depending on the context, depending on the environment they're working on, depending on their situation, so different factors can influence how an individual perceives fairness. And these different factors can also influence how acute or how relevant the fair treatment is to a specific individual. If we look at the fish here, I mean, the small fish thinks there is clearly no justice in the world because everyone is going to eat me. Whereas the big fish thinks, oh, the world is just because I'm not getting eaten. I can do what I want. So it depends very much on the circumstances within which the fair or unfair treatment occurs. And when we talk about people's perception of fairness, that can be quite an abstract concept, especially if we say it is subjective. Then the first reaction is often, oh, well, then what can we do about it? There are actually a few dimensions which help us to better understand what fairness is. And in general, we look at three dimensions of organizational justice and fairness. One is distributive. So this is about how individuals perceive the fairness of distribution of resources between parties. So are decisions made based on need and equality, equity, but not only equality. Not everyone needs to get the same. It is also about equity and about the need, about what have people contributed, for example. The second dimension is procedural. So what are the processes and procedures that are in place for decision making? Do they sufficiently are they sufficiently consistent? Do they avoid bias? Do they allow the voice of people participating? These are some of the kind of criteria which individuals use to judge if a process and procedures are fair. And the third dimension is interactional. So how are people treated? How are the outcomes and the procedures communicated? And this very much relates to treating people with dignity, with respect, but also how information is shared. So when we talk about being treated fairly or unfairly, we kind of unconsciously use these different dimensions and the different criteria which underlie these dimensions to make these fairness judgments within the context we are operating in. And the aim of our study, which we conducted a couple of years ago, was published last summer, the report from the Association for Project Management. The aim of that study was really to investigate which factors influence the perceptions of fairness in inter-organizational projects and the impacts of the fair and unfair treatment. Because inter-organizational projects bring a different, or inter-organizational relationships bring a different complexity to fairness perceptions. We do not just have one authority who might treat us fairly or unfairly. We work with external organizations who might have an authority over us, like a project manager, a client who we also receive treatment from. And how did we study that? We actually asked different project managers to conduct a diary for us. And over a period of 4 weeks, they wrote regular diaries, not in handwriting like this one here, but they wrote detailed diaries about their experiences of fairness and unfairness in their working life. We also interviewed them, and so we got very rich data, which we used to inform our findings. And Kate is going to introduce you to some of the findings of our study now.
Thank you very much, Christine. Yes, so we started in looking at the aspects of project working that the participants talked about, fairness and unfairness, and they talked about fair and equitable distribution of workload and resources, particularly workload. But they also talked about rewards. Now, rewards weren't necessarily financial. Actually, people tended to talk about non-financial rewards, i.e. getting praise and recognition, but also potentially opportunities for career and professional development. The next area they were talked about was in terms of fair procedures and processes, rules, regulations. Now, this wasn't just in terms of the project team, but also in terms of their organisation and whether there was these matched up. And again, with these, they were looking at in terms of whether there was a voice, whether they had a voice, whether they could influence decisions. So policies and procedures was one area. The final area related to interactions between themselves and other members of the project team. And it's whether those interactions were, whether they were talked to in a respectful way, whether it was supportive and polite, but also in terms of the manner in which information was conveyed to them. Was it communicated in a timely manner? Was it clear? Was the source, was the manner in which it was conveyed to them, was it from a reliable and competent source? So these were the areas where people discussed with us what they felt fairness and unfairness in a project related to. The next set of findings related to the influences of unfairness and unfairness in projects. Generally, people talked to us about how they expected fairness or how they tolerated unfairness, and this was particularly in relation to the source of the treatment of the fairness or the unfairness. Now, sources could be from an individual or from an organisation, and those organisations could be your own intra-organisation you work for or an external organisation. With participants talking particularly about feeling most keenly some sort of unfairness from somebody within their own organisation. That seemed to be the source that impacted them the most. The next area was so like in terms of an influence, people talk about temporality and frequency of treatment. So a more permanent source of treatments, for example, a participant's own organisation, was held to higher standards than, say, their treatment from a temporary source, sort of like somebody else from a project team, which was, at some point their relationship would end, hence unfairness would end. The next element related to, frequency, I forgot about that. The more frequent something was, the more likely it was to become unfair. The next element related to authority and accountability. So our participants who held in their mind a good balance between authority and accountability tended to experience or talk about less unfairness than participants who felt that they were being held responsible or accountable for actions that they did not have the authority over. And then the final element, influencing factor. People talked about how they reflected on what had occurred to them, and then in using that element of reflection, then determined how acute or not their feelings of unfairness or fairness were. So that might be reflecting on their own actions. Could they have done something differently? Reflecting on the actions of the source of unfairness. So that might be putting themselves in somebody else's, well, I understand why they might have done that. But also in terms of putting what happened to them in context to what had happened to them previously in their careers. And so using context to reflect on what had occurred to them. So the next finding section that we had in the report looked at impacts, and these impacts generally, fair treatment was positive, unfair treatment was negative, but I'll come back to that at the end. But firstly, participants talked about their experience at an individual level. So how what had occurred to them had impacted on their ways of working. So fair treatment supported career development, professional and personal development, whereas unfair treatment may well have negatively impacted on their job security and on the workload. They also talked about how their relationships were impacted, particularly trust with other members of the project teams. The next element was in terms of how their feelings were impacted. So positive feelings of appreciation and being valued and supported came out of fairness. However, unfairness left people feeling disappointed, frustrated, taken for granted. And then there was also issues in terms of health and well-being, that actually unfairness did leave people feeling emotionally and physically exhausted. but also impacts were less direct. So participants talked about how an indirect outcome of the treatment, whether fair or unfair, were at an organisational level. So, and impacted on perhaps organisational objectives or the reputation of the company or access to workforces. It also impacted on the projects, whether it be in terms of project collaboration, project performance, or project citizenship between the people within the project's team. One would say that participants did talk about how they used unfairness particularly as a learning experience, and often would make changes to the way they work because of something that unfairness had occurred to them. And on occasion, these changes caused by unfairness had actually created positive impacts for both the organisation and the project. This isn't just suggesting it's a good idea to go and be unfair because you might get a good project outcome. However, people did talk about how personal changes they made had actually positively impacted following levels of unfairness against them. So I'll just hand you back to Christine for the next slide.
Apologies, I was on mute. As Manon said earlier, we are in the context of the Equality Diversity event happening next week, and we haven't actually conducted research in the context of the role of fairness in equality and diversity and inclusion. So first of all, we had a bit of a look what others have said, and I've mentioned earlier that equality is one aspect, what is being used to inform fairness perceptions, but it is only one aspect, and many other aspects, as we've outlined today, do also play a role. And when it comes to diversity, a previous study which we've cited here has found that effective diversity management results from a decision-making process that meets the normative principles of organizational justice. So if we adopt decision-making processes, so procedures which are aligned with the principles of organizational justice, it is more likely that we can have effective diversity management in our organization and in our project. However, this is still very much an area of development in the context of fairness research and what role it can play in this space. We are actually currently writing a funding application to investigate that further, and hope that we will have the chance to do it, because we do believe and we do see that there are links, and I think probably many of you here in the call, and we can have this discussion in a moment, and it would be very interesting to hear that with the fair principles and procedures embedded in a project, which facilitate the more transparent decision making, the consistent processes which require of the people affected having a voice in the decision-making processes. These are all principles which do support inclusivity, which do support diversity. So yeah, but very much an area still under further development. And what we've found from our study are some general recommendations for different groups, which Kate will just provide an overview now.
Thank you, Christine. So in the report we did for the APM last year, we made recommendations for three groupings. Firstly, in terms of individuals, and it's really for individuals within projects teams, project managers, to be aware of the impact of their actions on others, whether it be a subordinate or another member of the project team, a contractor, a supplier, and not just be aware of their actions, but also to actively ask for feedback on whether or not their actions are fair. So that might be asking for feedback in terms of whether a decision they've made has added excess workload to another member of the team. So seeking feedback and being aware of our own actions. The next element was in terms of organisations, and the suggestions are that at an organisation level, there's investment in building skills and capabilities of employees in terms of applying fairness in their everyday lives and in their work in projects, but also enabling individuals to implement fair and equitable processes and procedures, and also ensuring that an organisation learns from past instances of injustice and unfairness, capture those, and then also try not to repeat them. And then the final area was in terms of what the profession can do, and that is there is a role in our view for the professional institutions to raise awareness of fairness and unfairness and organisational justice in projects, whether that's by research, excellent, but also in terms of dissemination activities, so like today's webinar, workshops and publications.
Because we started with a quote, so we're going to finish with a quote. Being good is easy, what is difficult is being just. So fairness is not about being good or being nice and handing out things. It is about adopting the principles of fairness and justice in your behavior and in your processes and procedures. And here are our contact details in case you would like to get in touch and follow up.